Good morning, everybody. I'm Mikael Sandlund, an expert member of SMER, the National Committee, and now we will focus on surrogacy until 11:15. It's 11:45 in the program, I just noted, but that's not quite correct because then we won't have any coffee. But it's also possible to speak during coffee breaks. So this is surrogacy is a complicated question, and it as all complicated and value-laden, ethically relevant questions, there is a part of empirical facts which have to be established, and there are moral assumptions and ethical issues to be discussed. And SMER has been doing this for about 10 years. It was in 2013, about 10 years ago, and then a majority of members supported the introduction of altruistic surrogacy in Sweden. It had no effect, perhaps on the debate, but not on legislation. So it's, well, as you mentioned, Jenny, it's a neither nor, still a neither nor situation, or perhaps not in my backyard situation. That depends on how you see it. Well, this year, SMER again, the Council again, has been discussing this topic, and we have examined numerous arguments for and against, but we have not reached a conclusion. So that's perhaps one reason why this day is we have this seminar, so that we can be a bit wiser. And the empirical facts, what are known about surrogacy, and all parties, the children, the surrogates, and the children of surrogates, and of course the intended parents, all these perspectives are extremely important. So today's session, we will learn about empirical research on surrogacy families and how our neighboring countries, that is Finland, Norway, and Denmark, and their ethics councils have addressed the question of surrogacy. So, at first, we are delighted to have a leading expert in the field with us today, Professor Susan Golombuk from she's a professor emerita of family research at the University of Cambridge and former director of the university's Center for Family Research. And you've been doing longitudinal studies on the psychological outcomes for surrogacy families and other types of families. And these works are extremely widely cited. So it's a pleasure to welcome you here. And after your presentation, the Nordic neighbors will have a short presentation and describe what's. So Susan, please, floor is yours. Very welcome.
Great. Okay, thank you very much for inviting me here today. It's a real pleasure. So what I'm going to talk about is the research that we've been conducting at the Center for Family Research in Cambridge on surrogacy families. So I'm going to focus, excuse me, on 3 studies. Firstly, our longitudinal study of surrogacy families with heterosexual parents. Secondly, a longitudinal study of surrogates and their families. And thirdly, a study of gay father families formed through surrogacy. A couple of days ago, just by accident, I was clearing out some files in my office, and I came across a government report from Sweden about this topic from 2016. So I had a look at it, and I discovered that it said that 2 of the reasons for deciding not to allow surrogacy in Sweden, in terms of the research, is that the research hadn't yet, the longitudinal study hadn't followed up children until they were adults, so we didn't know what children born through surrogacy felt about it once they had grown up. And the second thing was that we didn't know anything about how the surrogates' own children felt. So as it happens, 2 of the studies I'm going to talk about today cover these issues. So hopefully, it may not change people's minds, but it will at least fill in these gaps that cause people to hesitate about allowing surrogacy to happen. So some of the questions that have come up about surrogacy are as follows. So in the late 1990s, I was on a government committee in the United Kingdom to look at certain aspects of surrogacy law in the UK. And it became very clear that a lot of the questions that were coming up about the families and the children just simply hadn't been addressed. There were no empirical data whatsoever to tell us what actually happened. So some of the questions that were of concern were, firstly, would children be psychologically harmed by the knowledge that had been created specifically to be given away to other parents? Would they feel abandoned by the woman who gave birth to them? And who would they see as their so-called real mother? Would it be the surrogate or the intended mother? Would that be different if the surrogate was their genetic mother? And also another issue that was a concern was how would children feel if they knew that money had exchanged hands in order for them to be born? There were also questions about the intended mothers arising from surrogacy. So would the intended mother find it difficult to bond with her baby if she hadn't experienced the pregnancy? Of course, we know a little bit about this from adoption, but it's a slightly different situation. And also, if the surrogate remained in contact with the family, as seemed to be happening in some cases, would that undermine the relationship between the intended mother and the child? So in the first study that I'm going to talk about, we set out to examine some of these questions. We recruited a sample of 42 families formed through surrogacy, and we were very lucky in that we were able to work with the Office of National Statistics in the United Kingdom, which registers all surrogacy births. So we actually had a very representative sample. They weren't just volunteers, but actually a representative sample of surrogacy families. And for some that hadn't yet had a parental order, we topped up the sample a little with families created through the organisation COTS, which was an organisation that helped couples wanting to have surrogacy. We compared these families with 2 control groups. So firstly, a group of 51 egg donation families to control for the use of assisted reproduction, and also a group of 80 natural conception families who hadn't used any kind of assisted reproduction, who were matched as closely as possible to the assisted reproduction families in terms of demographic factors. So really our research questions were, do surrogacy families differ from egg donation or natural conception families with respect to the quality of relationships between parents and their children, and also in the psychological adjustment of the children? And we also wanted to find out, how do children themselves feel about having been born through surrogacy? We were also interested in the relationship between the family and the surrogate and how that unfolded over time, because it was assumed or often stated that once the intended parents had their child, they would lose interest in the surrogate and the surrogate would kind of be rejected from the family. All of the children were born in the year 2000 at the millennium. We collected in-depth data from mothers, from the fathers, from the children, and also from the children's school teachers with the parents' consent to get an independent assessment of the child's behavior at school. Now, the teachers didn't know that they were born through surrogacy. They just knew they were part of a study of different kinds of families. But we felt it was important to get an independent assessment, particularly with a study like this, which is very controversial. And one issue could be that the parents are trying to present their family in the best possible light. So this, as I say, was a longitudinal study. It began when the children were 1 year old, and we followed them up 7 times. So we saw them when they were 1, when they were 2, when they were 3. Then again in middle childhood at ages 7 and 10, and then in adolescence at age 14, and finally at age 20 when they were young adults. So what did we find? Firstly, when the children were 1, we found that contrary to the concerns that had been expressed about these families, that where there were differences, the surrogacy families actually obtained higher ratings of constructs such as warmth, enjoyment in their infants. Also, we found that the surrogacy mothers and fathers, compared with the natural conception families, were more emotionally involved with their infants. Generally, the egg donation families were very like the surrogacy families, so I won't mention them today. At age 2, again, where there were differences, the surrogacy families actually seem to be doing better in terms of our assessments of parenting. Here we used an in-depth interview designed to assess the nature of the bond between the parents and the child. And for example, the surrogacy mothers were rated as showing less anger, feelings of guilt and disappointment in the children than the natural conception families. And the fathers found parenting less stressful. At age 2, we found that in terms of the children themselves, using questionnaires of their emotional and behavioral development, there were no differences in social, emotional, and cognitive development. Similar findings again at age 3. So again, the surrogacy mothers were rated as being more affectionate and as interacting more with their toddlers. So in the preschool years, where there were differences, the surrogacy families tended to be even more involved as parents than the natural conception. We then went back next when the children were 7. Now, 7 is an interesting age because by this time, children's cognitive development has progressed in such a way that they have a greater understanding of reproduction, of inheritance, and also in terms of adopted children, they understand more fully what it means to be adopted, and not just the positive side, but also that this means the loss of their birth family. We found that almost all of the parents had told their children about their birth by surrogacy at age 7. Now, in terms of relationships between mothers and children at age 7, we found that the findings from before, they were doing very well. They weren't, by this time, more involved than the natural conception parents, but they were generally very well-functioning families. The children themselves were also, in terms of their social and emotional adjustment, were functioning well within the normal range. But we did find that the surrogacy children overall showed slightly raised levels of emotional and behavioral problems at age 7 compared with the children in the unassisted conception families. This was interesting because it actually parallels what studies of adoptive families with internationally adopted children find, that at age 7, these are particularly studies in the Netherlands that have carried out large-scale studies of internationally adopted families. Similar finding, at age 7, these children on average show higher rates of emotional and behavioral difficulties than non-adopted children. And then when we next went back at age 10, we found that the children had gone back down to the same levels of functioning as the unassisted reproduction children. And interesting, that follows the same pattern as the Dutch researchers found about internationally adopted children. Now, what's interesting here is the Dutch researchers put this down to internationally adopted children who don't look like their parents have to deal with issues of identity earlier than other children. And so it seems that perhaps the same is happening with surrogacy, because these children knew they were born through surrogacy. People were asking them questions, and they were having to think about these kinds of issues. But interestingly, by the time they had reached age 10, they had gone back to the same level of functioning as the other children. We then began at that age to speak to the children themselves and ask them how they felt about being born through surrogacy. Just to give you a few quotes, one child said, "She was really kind about carrying me in her tummy." Another said, "I think she's kind and she's lovely and funny." And another child said, "I feel fine. I don't feel bad or cross in any way. It's just pretty much nature, so I can't do anything about it. I wouldn't like to do anything about it." Now, adolescence, of course, is another developmental transition which raises issues that might be relevant to surrogacy. It's a time where issues of identity generally become important, and also autonomy separating from parents. It's also a time when difficulties or friction between parents and children is more likely to arise. And to the extent that surrogacy parallels adoption in some ways, it's also important to be aware that for adopted children, identity and adjustment can become important issues at adolescence. And also for adoptive parents, adolescence can be challenging, because it's a time that children may want to find out more about being adopted and start asking questions, or more in-depth questions than before. In fact, when we went back to see our surrogacy families when the children were adolescents at age 14, we found that the surrogacy children were doing really well in terms of all our measures of emotional and behavioral development. But it's also, interestingly, we found that both from the measures we gave the mothers about the children and from the measures the children completed themselves. So in a way that provided more support for the fact that this was a genuine finding. So these adolescents showed high levels of psychological adjustment at age 14. Only one of them expressed some unhappiness about being born through surrogacy, but when we interviewed them about their feelings, the majority were either uninterested or actually saw it as an advantage. So just to give you a couple of quotes, Simon, when he was 14, said, "I was talking to someone at school and they said they were an accident. I know I was really wanted and it makes me feel special." Chris, age 14, said, "I think it's cool. I quite like talking about it because it's an interesting fact about me." We finally went back, as I said, when they were young adults at age 20, again using in-depth interviews with the mothers and also with the young people themselves, as well as questionnaire assessments of constructs such as parental acceptance, quality of family relationships, and quality of family communication. And we interviewed the young adults as well as the parents. So we found in terms of the mothers, they were showing high levels of psychological well-being, just like the mothers in the other family types. And also in terms of the quality of relationship between mothers and their children born from surrogacy, these were good, and again, no different from the comparison group in terms of either interview or questionnaire measures. The young adults themselves showed high levels of psychological well-being, either comparing groups using standardized questionnaires, but also using general population norms for young people aged between 17 and 23. We also, they were rated by psychiatrists, so we contained detailed information about any emotional, social, behavioral problems they had. And these transcripts were rated by psychiatrists who didn't know about the child's family type. And again, we found that the children were generally doing well, and the rates of problems were actually lower than in the general population. So generally they seem to be well adjusted. But we also wanted to know what these young adults thought themselves about being born through surrogacy. So again, I'd just like to give you a few quotes. One said, "It's not a big deal to me. When I was younger, I was curious about how it worked, so I looked it up. It seems clear that they wanted me as a child, as opposed to it being accidental or something like that. So I'd say it's a positive thing. I'm happy about it. I've always been happy about it." Another said, "I don't really see what difference it's going to make in my life. It's not changed anything so far. I'm more than happy about it. It's nothing I really dwell on. I usually have more important things to really care about." Another said, "It's so normal for me because I've known about it ever since I can remember. I know that my mum is my mum and my birth mum is my auntie, as we call her auntie. That's just how it's always been." Another said, "I think it's amazing. It shows how much I was wanted. It's just such an amazing story and such an amazing thing to do for a friend, such a genuine act of friendship." And another, the final two, "I appreciate the fact that my parents went to such lengths to have me, and that makes me feel very wanted and safe. I've never felt isolated or distanced from my mum because she was always there when I was growing up. I just felt it felt really normal. It didn't ever really have any negative emotions, and I certainly don't now." And finally, this young person said, "I've so much admiration and appreciation for the surrogate, because obviously without her I wouldn't be here. I think it's a different kind of love. It's nice to know that there are people out there who do these amazing things for their friends. I think it takes a real special kind of person, and because of that, there's that kind of love and connection there." Now, another issue was that we were interested in the parents' relationship with the surrogate, and we looked at this until the children were 10 years old. Generally, they reported a positive relationship. We did find that their contact decreased over time, but 60% of the families were still in touch with the surrogate by the time the child was 10 years old. And those who are most likely to have lost contact with were those who they had previously not known. So I'd like to go on now to the second study, which, as far as I know, is the only long-term follow-up study of surrogates that looks also at surrogate mothers' own children by my colleagues Vasanti Jadva and Susan Imrie. So they followed up 34 surrogate mothers and 36 of their children aged 20 to 25 years. And they interviewed them between 5 and 15 years after the birth of the surrogacy child. Now here, the findings showed, even asking the surrogates, that generally they were happy with the relationship with the intended parents, and also that the majority were still in touch with the families they helped create. So in this study, they found that 75% of the surrogate mothers had kept in touch with the family. I mean, it wasn't a huge amount, but on average, they would see them once or twice a year. And almost half of the surrogate's own children were in contact with the surrogacy child. It's interesting, there was a lot of variation in how the surrogate's own children saw the child the mother had had for another family. Some saw them very much as part of their family, would find names to describe this relationship, such as my surrogate sister or my tummy sister. Others didn't really see them as being part of their family at all. So a lot of variation. And they, Jadva and Imrie interviewed the surrogate's children, about half of them. So again, a couple of quotes. This one said, "I think it's a really nice thing to do for someone. Obviously, if they can't have children and they really want a child, that's a bad thing. So if someone else is able to do that for you and help you through, then it's something that's compassionate, really." Another said, "I think it's amazing. It's difficult for a woman to give away a child that she's given birth to, and I just think it's fantastic that my mum can and make people so happy." I just want to, especially because of what Jenny said earlier, just one mention of a study that one of my PhD students, Nishita Lamba, carried out in India with Indian surrogates. I think the issue here is how well the surrogates are treated by the clinics. But just to one really standout finding from this study is that the surrogate, which I think relates to something you said, Jenny, that the surrogate, the thing that upset them most was not being able to see the child they gave birth to. And that seemed to be quite standard practice. And they said, I'm not the mother of a child, I don't want this child, but I'd like to at least see the child and ideally have some contact or a photograph or something like that. So it seems that, particularly in this clinic in India, that the surrogacy was carried out in quite an inhumane, uncompassionate way. Contrasts very strongly to other countries, such as, I think, the UK, where there's contact is encouraged and seems to work out well over time. I think I've got 5 minutes, is that right? 5 minutes, great. All right. So the last study I want to mention is a study of gay father families created through surrogacy. At the time we carried out this study, there weren't so many gay father families in the UK. There are now, but we carried it out, in fact, in the US in collaboration with Columbia University in New York, and we compared 42-parent gay father families with a child born through surrogacy and obviously egg donation, with 55 lesbian mother families with a child born through sperm donation, again to control for the use of assisted reproduction. And the children were aged about 6 on average. So here, these families are very different from the traditional family in a number of ways, because the children were conceived using a donated egg, born to a surrogate mother, raised by 2 fathers. Only one was a genetic father of the child, and of course there was no mother in the family home. So there's been a lot of concern about these families, partly because it's assumed that men are less suited to parenting than are women. So we were interested here in this study to look at the question, does the quality of parenting differ between gay father and lesbian mother families? And also, does the psychological adjustment of the children differ? In fact, we found no difference in the quality of parenting between gay father and lesbian mother families, and that was very positive and functioning well. The children had very low levels of behavioral and emotional problems, well below the levels you'd see in the general population, both using standardized questionnaires and again using child psychiatrist ratings of a psychiatrist who was unaware of the child's family type. And in fact, there were even lower levels of emotional problems among the children of gay fathers than among the lesbian mothers. I'm not quite sure we could go into that, but for the sake of time, I won't. But I'm happy to answer questions. In terms of the ratings by the child psychiatrist, only 5% of children in gay father families and 9% of children in lesbian mother families showed some kind of psychological disorder. Again, this is below the general population norms for psychiatric disorder. The fathers were more likely to maintain contact with the surrogate than the egg donor. So in the year preceding the study, 53% of the fathers had seen the surrogate, compared with only 8% who had been in touch with the egg donor. There was a range in the quality of relationship between gay fathers and the surrogate. Some had a very close relationship. So the first one said, here we have a great relationship. She's like a relative to us. We're very close to her husband. It was a real bonding experience for us. I think they're probably some of the closest people to us, really. Another father said, she'll always be special in our lives. She will always have a place there. We will always remain in contact if she wants to. But others were more distant. So this father said, the type of relationship we wanted to have was one of someone who's almost like a family member, but more like a distant cousin. It's more of a sort of distant family member who comes into their lives from time to time. So, summing up very, very quickly, The findings of the empirical studies that we've carried out in Cambridge of surrogacy families point to positive family relationships and well-adjusted children. Just because people become parents in non-conventional ways doesn't seem to make them less capable parents or love their children less. In fact, our findings suggest that the opposite is true, that those who struggled against the odds to have children become particularly involved with them and particularly committed parents. I've rushed through a lot today. This is my most recent book that actually interviews families, it tells their stories, but also it lists all the academic research, all of our studies at the back. So if anybody would like to know more, or if anyone would like some of the academic papers, then do email me and I'd be very happy to send them. But thank you for having me here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan. Very reassuring facts. Questions and remarks in the end of this section. So I will now welcome Kati Mylimäki. And you are chair of the Finnish Ethics Council and also a general practitioner and medical advisor. So what about the discussion in Finland? Please.
Thank you. Inviting me here to Stockholm. And as I was presented, my background is I'm a general practitioner. I also used to work in a maternity clinic when I was doing clinical work, and I have two experiences of surrogacy myself in my clinical work. One was a middle-aged woman who wanted to give birth to her daughter's family. And it was before the legislation was changed in Finland. And so it was not illegal, but it was not officially allowed. And this family, they wanted to do the follow-up of the pregnancy in my private practice. And I was worried. I was not sure what to do and if it's okay. And the middle-aged lady had overweight and blood pressure and what if complications come. But everything went well. And I saw that little boy later on when they came to my practice to show that wonderful child, and I was very happy. And the other case was when I was medical chief officer, and there was one mildly retarded woman who was being used of an elderly couple, and that was her third pregnancy. And was going to give birth with false identity. And we found that and moving around in Finland and in different towns, so the social workers didn't find out. And then they were giving these babies away for adoption, and especially for money. So that was a criminal case. So 2007, the legislation came, and now it's not allowed to use any techniques for birth or fertilization if the plan is to give the baby away for adoption. And now we know that legislation, rules, recommendations, supervision, follow-up and research is needed. I'm very happy that I have heard so much this morning. Now we have this discussion that should we have that? We know that some Finnish families, they go to other countries. Russia, not anymore, of course. Ukraine, not anymore, of course. But USA and Georgia are countries that families have gone. And we don't have the register, how many, especially they. But it's okay when they come to Finland and they will be registered as citizens and so on and so on. But we would need legislation. And what will happen, that we are now having a new discussion, and also these same-sex families are quite active, and also gay parenthood, and it's possible that we will have a legislation more allowing in the future, but just now our government is quite conservative, and also the Christian Democratic Party is in the government, and they are also against of supporting economically IVF for lesbian families if there is not a medical problem. That social differences would not be allowed. But I think that after next parliament election, that the discussion will go forward, but not very fast. So we have our medical committee, and we are dealing both social and medical issues. So it's different from other Nordic countries. And in our discussions, we have been discussing that surrogacy is not only a technical or medical issue, like we've heard today. It's also very much of social, and also that we are emphasizing in our discussions. It's the rights and benefits of the child, and it's not a subjective right to have a biological baby of your own. And in our discussions, we noticed that define that if we want to allow non-commercial surrogacy, it's quite different to really difficult to differentiate from commercial, because the idea would be that you should have to cover the costs of the surrogate mother, and what if complications arise, and so the question of money always is an issue. And so now also in Finland, the discussion of gender dysphoria is issue that in discussions that if you would have a surrogate to bring you a baby because you have this gender dysphoria, and you would be biologically okay and medically okay to bear a child, but you just don't want to, and how you would deal with that. And so future, I think the political pressure is that the birth rate is going down, and there are all kind of discussions about what to do, and would we need more economical support for families and for babies, or are we allowing more immigration, and also very kind of negative discussion in some groups that if their refugee families are having more babies than the original Finnish families, and so it sometimes had a little bit also a racist color, this kind of discussion, which is very sad. But so the whole idea is that the whole society has to decide how do we support all the families, and I mean all the families. Thank you.
Yeah, indeed. You managed to keep on schedule. That's commendable. Thank you so much. Not only for this, also for all information given. So we move on to Norway. Next speaker is Dr. Håvard Øritsland Eggestøl, Senior Advisor at the Norwegian Biotechnology Advisory Board. Please. Floor is yours. What about Norway?
Thank you so much for that introduction, and for the opportunity to come here and present a statement from the Norwegian Biotechnology Advisory Board, should surrogacy be allowed in Norway. In addition, I will tell you about a survey we conducted among Norwegian women in the fertile age of 18 to 45 years, asking whether they could be a surrogate mother if surrogacy was allowed in Norway. Yeah. Surrogacy is often is one of the more prevalent topics within biotechnology in the public debate. News about celebrities getting children through surrogacy often spark public interest. But this spring, the Liberal Party, also known as Venstre in Norwegian, put forward a motion in the parliament regarding surrogacy, asking the parliament to instruct the government to put down a commission of inquiry regarding non-commercial surrogacy. The parliament majority voted against the motion, arguing that it wasn't a time for such an inquiry. Rather, the parliament should wait until the assessment of the Biotechnology Act was done. So, what is this assessment? Well, in 2020, the Norwegian Parliament adopted many changes to the Biotechnology Act. Among them was allowing egg donation and assisted reproduction to single parents, as well as many other changes. The Parliament also determined that the Biotechnology Act should be dynamically assessed, and what this entailed wasn't defined, but is generally understood as a more frequent assessment. As of this year, the first of these dynamic assessments was initiated from the government. Both us at the Norwegian Biotechnology Advisory Board and the Norwegian Directorate of Health was tasked with this assignment. These two assessments shall constitute the background documents for the recommendation from the government. That will either be a legislative proposal or a white paper. The board decided to publish all of its recommendations continuous as they are/will be produced, while the Director of Health will publish one large collection. The board chose to deal with the issue of surrogacy first and published a statement in August of this year. The statement focuses on its discussions on whether Norway should allow surrogacy on its territory, and in particular on non-commercial arrangements, as it is considered the most politically relevant arrangement in the Norwegian context. However, commercial surrogacy was also considered in the statements, as well as recommendations regarding the practice of Norwegians traveling abroad and getting surrogacy performed there. Each year, some Norwegians travel abroad to get surrogacy performed. This number fluctuates between somewhere in the 20s and somewhere in the 50s. When surrogacy is performed abroad, the social and often genetic mother must go through a stepchild adoption process in order to gain the legal right as a parent. The number in this table is the number of applications to this process. This means that the children coming to Norway as a result of surrogacy is likely slightly higher, as twins are more common in such pregnancies compared to natural pregnancies, as well as this number does not reflect single male parents getting children through surrogacy. In Norway, surrogacy isn't specifically prohibited, but there are a few paragraphs restricting the legality. Essentially, surrogacy is prohibited, except for the practice of surrogacy through home insemination, which is extremely rare. We are only aware of one account of this. In general, Norwegian law doesn't cover actions committed by Norwegians abroad, but there have been a discussion in Norway to limit the use of surrogacy abroad, and among the suggestions are including surrogacy in a list of particularly severe crimes and that the Norwegian authorities can prosecute, even though they are committed outside of Norwegian territory. That list includes acts such as terrorism, war crimes, and child marriage, among others. The Norwegian Biotechnology Advisory Board concluded their discussions with 6 recommendations on 3 topics. On the topic of non-commercial surrogacy, 9 members voted against allowing non-commercial surrogacy in Norway. Important arguments for them was the medical risk of the surrogate mother, the precautionary principle, and the risk of pressuring the surrogate mother into an agreement. 6 members voted for non-commercial surrogacy, arguing that the woman should be given the freedom to determine what is best for herself, and surrogacy on Norwegian territory would reduce the pressure on the surrogate mother. the risk of exploitation, and ensuring good health services for the surrogate mother. On the topic of commercial surrogacy, 13 members voted against allowing it in Norway, quoting arguments of pressure on the surrogate mother and transforming children from gifts to commodities. 2 members voted against allowing commercial surrogacy, arguing that surrogacy in general should be allowed, with many of the same arguments as for non-commercial surrogacy. On the topic of penalizing surrogacy abroad, 8 members voted for it. They argued that there should not be a sanction-free opportunity to avoid Norwegian legislation through surrogacy abroad. 7 members voted against penalizing surrogacy abroad, arguing that penal actions should be aimed at clinics, health personnel, and organizations offering surrogacy. So, should surrogacy be allowed in Norway? No, according to the majority of the Norwegian Biotechnology Advisory Board. We also performed a study among Norwegian women with the main goal of figuring out whether there is a practical reality of establishing surrogacy in Norway, in terms of are there enough potential surrogate mothers among Norwegians. This survey was carried out by the polling company Norstat. We asked 1,650 females in the fertile age, defined as 18 or 45 years old. That's the age span where you can receive IVF treatments. For most of the demographics, there were no major biases, with the exceptions of our respondents who tended to not have any children. This could at least to some part be explained by the low age interval. However, we did not observe any tendencies dependent on demographics in our data. That means that our data does not support the hypothesis of having children impacts your tendency to either considering being a surrogate mother or whether you think surrogacy should be allowed. So to the results. Among our respondents, almost 30% would consider being a surrogate mother, either in a commercial or a non-commercial form. If these numbers reflect the population at large, it is safe to say that even a non-commercial arrangement would cover the demand of surrogacy in Norway, even if the demand would dramatically increase. And since we had the women responding to our main question, we also chose to ask them what their general attitude towards surrogacy was. And surprisingly, a big majority of almost 80% of the women agreed with allowing surrogacy in Norway, either in a commercial or a non-commercial form. These data are in line with other survey data, suggesting that Norwegians are more liberal than the legislations. Here we see the result from the Norwegian National Election Study, a huge survey conducted among Norwegian voters. And in 2013, for the first time, a question on surrogacy was included among the questions asked and has been asked since. It is clear in these data that that there is a majority of Norwegians who agree with the statement that it should be allowed to use a surrogate mother in Norway. And in 2021, it was almost a double amount of respondents agreeing compared to those who disagreed. And it isn't only the Norwegian public who are turning more liberal. The Norwegian Biotechnology Advisory Board are as well. Back in 2015, the board also published a statement on surrogacy, where there was a much bigger majority for continuing the prohibition line. So, as both Norwegian public and experts are turning more liberal regarding surrogacy, the question that remains are, will Norwegian politicians liberalize surrogacy? The answer to this question lies at least a couple of years ahead of us. So, thank you so much to Smer for giving the opportunity to come here and give my talk. And if any of you have any questions or comments, please do not hesitate to reach out. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And it's special thing that you vote in your ethic council. So we don't do this in SMER, in the Swedish Council, but it's rather interesting. So last speaker in this section would be Dr. Martin Eising Christensen, Senior Advisor at the Danish Ethics Council. So what about the situation in Denmark? Please.
Thank you, and thanks for the introduction and the opportunity to come and present. Yes, and talk about surrogacy in Denmark, and I'll give you a brief overview of the Danish Ethics Council's most recent report on surrogacy from the beginning of 2023, I think. And I'll first say a bit about the general approach to the topic, mostly from the ethical side. We'd heard a lot about the factual, empirical, and I even think we referred to you. And then I'll say a bit about the current regulation in Denmark, and finally the Council's recommendations, and also a bit about the current discussion in Denmark. So some of this is in Danish, it's from the report, but this is just kind of the basic idea, and it's already been mentioned that there are different considerations that you have to weigh and balance, and that the intended parents, the child, the surrogate, and perhaps also sometimes broader societal considerations, whether it's children in general, women in general, or something else. Something we tried to do was, and it's also been implicit in what's been said, to map the different contexts in which these different considerations are in play in surrogacy, because there are so many forms and varieties and so on. And this is again in Danish, and I'll just say a bit, but one thing is the motivation, which takes up a lot of room, kind of, is it commercial, is it altruistic, and the first part is just to illustrate that the surrogate, her motivation can be altruistic or commercial or somewhere in between. And then the other part is there can be people who facilitate the interaction and relation between the surrogate and the intended parents, agencies, or something else. And it can also be altruistic or commercial. Then there's kind of the genetics of the child. How does that come about? Is the intended parents who contribute? Is it the surrogate mother? Is it a donor, and so on? Then there's indication, at least as we call it in Denmark. What's the reason for practicing surrogacy? Is it medical? Is it biological? You don't have a womb, none of you, or is it social? And it's already also been discussed. Then there's a bit about, who's juridically is the parents. What determines that status? Is it genetics? Is it birth? Is it intention? Who started this process? And finally, we've also had a part about pregnancy and birth. Who influences that? Who has the kind of, is it the intended parents who have a lot to say? Is it the surrogate mother? Is it both? Or is it juridically legal, or is it kind of negotiation? That's just to illustrate kind of the complexity, and you can combine these in all kinds of ways and get 1,000 possible different forms of surrogacy. The final thing the Council also took into consideration was this whole international dimension, which has been mentioned also. And because if you recommend something in Denmark, it will interact with what's outside Denmark, either as a push people outside Denmark or pull people to Denmark. And this is just an accident that someone has been placed in Australia to illustrate, because I don't think anyone in Denmark goes to Australia, or Australians come to Denmark. But this is just to give you, that was the kind of main ethical perspective that the Council approached this topic from. And then, of course, there was the whole factual, empirical, what do we know about all these different interests in play, and I'll not say anything about that. Instead, I'll say a bit about the current regulation in Denmark, and it's somewhat similar to what have been mentioned. So there are some parts in Denmark that are regulated specifically, or specifically directed at surrogacy. So in our Artificial Reproduction Act, it forbids healthcare professionals to participate in surrogacy, whether it's commercial or altruistic. They are not, if they know about that it's a surrogacy, they are not allowed to participate. Then there's a separate part in Danish legislation where double donation or embryo donation is not allowed either in a surrogacy context. It's being liberalized in other contexts, but in surrogacy it's still not. Then there are parts from a Child Act. So this is the mater est principle, that the one who gives birth is always the mother in Denmark, at least at the start. Then part of the regulation is from the Adoption Act. So when people started thinking about surrogacy in the 80s, they had adoption acts and so on. So, and it's, yeah, facilitating surrogacy is not allowed. It's become part of that. So no one is allowed to do anything. You can find someone you know, someone you're related to, or go and ask a person on the street and so on, but no one else is allowed to kind of facilitate it. Then there's in the Child Act also, in principle, you're allowed to, so a bit perhaps like, was it Sweden or Norway, commercial surrogacy in a sense is not disallowed in Denmark. You can pay someone to carry a child for you. But if you sign a contract and so on, it's void, so you can't be sure that you'll get anything for your money. Yeah. And then also, adoption is not allowed in Denmark if the birth parent is paid to consent. And finally, also transfer of custody, or I'm not sure what it's called in English specifically, but is limited or more difficult if money has been involved. So that's specifically directed at commercial surrogacy. So that's the kind of current Danish regulation, a mix of different parts, and perhaps reflects the kind of complexity and variety of the different forms. In principle, the Danish Council, tried, or they agreed to try to say something about all these parts almost. So I'll say a bit about that, but so at top we vote in our council, so it was a bit of a surprise to me actually, but no one in the council, even the most liberal, thought that commercial surrogacy should be allowed in Denmark. So on the other hand, a big majority thought that health professionals should be able to participate in connection with altruistic surrogacy, which is not allowed as it is now. A majority also thought that double donation should be possible. We can always, if someone wants to, the different justifications for the different positions. 12 out of 16 also thought that it should be possible to facilitate contact if you open up this whole altruistic surrogacy thing. This perhaps is, someone said that it might be difficult to differentiate between altruistic, especially if you compensate for expenses and so on. And there was a discussion in the council, and they didn't want to put a number on it, but someone thought you could also symbolically compensate beyond covering the expenses. 10 thought that the surrogate should always be considered the mother still, and this pregnancy, birth, who has control, everyone thought that should be the surrogate mother, but you can of course always discuss if you change all the other things, how much power do you have in the end. Yes, so that's the council's recommendation. The final part I'll just say is about kind of current discussions in Denmark. So the council actually decided to make this report because the government established a committee that should look into commercial surrogacy in Denmark, and then they thought we'll also have a say. That committee didn't really agree about that much, but what has happened and what was also the background for that committee was that there had been both the Supreme Court in Denmark and the European Court of Human Rights had said that parents who have gone abroad and practice commercial surrogacy, it should be easier for them to become recognized as parents in Denmark for the sake of the child. So, and that's kind of what's been discussed most in Denmark, and also in terms of practical politics. So the most recent here is that the government and several other parties has agreed that it should be easier for parents who go abroad and practice commercial surrogacy to be recognized as parents when they return to Denmark for the sake of the child. So that's kind of where the discussion is right now in Denmark. And nothing has happened even with the council's recommendation about altruistic surrogacy and health professionals. So far, nothing has changed in terms of that. But I think that's, from Denmark. Okay, I'll just stay.
Thank you so much. Can I ask the persons who have had their presentations to come here on stage. So now it's time for remarks and discussions until 11:15. But first, what's about the chat, our web members of the seminar? Are there any comments? No, nothing in the chat. So please, publicum, and wait for the microphone. Yeah. Yes, there, in the middle. It's not polite to point at persons, but in some occasions.
Thank you.
Number 2, Göran.
My name is Ida Waikander. Thank you for your talks. It's very interesting to discuss these subjects. My question is very simple, because we heard about the cost for uterus transplantations. I would like to know what would you say is the cost for surrogacy in UK or in USA? What does it come to? Which cost does it come to for society or for the parents? Commercial or not commercial? So I'm mostly attending UK since you...
Oh, okay, thank you. So you asked about the cost in the UK. Yes. So commercial surrogacy is banned in the UK, always has been. What is allowed is so-called genuine expenses, but it's very grey area what that actually means. But in practice, it seems to be, in British pounds, about 10 to 12,000 pounds that the intended parents are allowed to compensate the surrogate for expenses. I'm not sure how much that is in Swedish krona, but maybe somebody can convert it. So that, yes, that's generally seen as being kind of acceptable, and above that is generally seen as not being acceptable. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay. Yes, it is regulated, because when the couple apply for a parental order in court to become the legal parents, the intended parents, then all of this is investigated in terms of how much the surrogate has been paid and so on. Yeah, I mean, you can never be absolutely sure that there hasn't been some under the table payment, but generally not. And surrogates in the UK say they're happy with this amount, they don't want it to be more, but they just want to be compensated in what they see as an acceptable way. Thank you.
Thank you. And the second question, not in the microphone, was about the regulations. It could be understood. Göran, please, have you number 2?
Thank you.
And any more hands? Number 3, 4, 5, and 6. Please, Göran.
Thank you. My name is Göran Kolste. Thank you for interesting surveys, Susan Golden Book. I have some questions on the perhaps method and in fact 3 questions when it comes to this inquiry about how surrogate mothers were caring for the children. First, you said surrogate mothers, but just in your presentation, but I suppose it's mothers to surrogate children that you talked about.
You mean, yes, so I mean, usually I would talk about surrogates rather than surrogate mothers, but some people use the terms interchangeably.
But surrogate mothers is
surrogate
to take care of the children. Who are the mothers?
The intended mothers are is the mother who raises the child.
Who raises
the surrogate mother gives birth.
Okay, so the first year that was, you talked about surrogate mothers who were caring for the children. It was those who have been, who have given birth to the children.
Yes, so the first study was about intended parents and the children growing up. The second study about surrogate mothers was the mother who gave birth.
Okay, but the first study, you said surrogate mothers when you said how they were caring for the children, so I think that was perhaps a mistake then, or?
I can't remember. I sometimes use the term surrogacy mothers, meaning mothers of children who'd been born through surrogacy.
Okay.
Sorry
so
if I've
that was my
caused
first
confusion.
question.
Yeah.
Okay, then it's clarified. How many were there? Is that my second question? How many did you interview or study?
In the first study of
Yeah.
the intended families, so 42 families started the study, and 20 years later, there were just over 50% of families still in the study. So we lost some along the way. That's quite normal. Of course, we don't know, perhaps these were the ones who had problems. We can't really know that. But we did look at, for example, the ones that we lost to follow up. Were these the ones where perhaps the children had more problems earlier on and so on? And we couldn't find anything that distinguished the ones who stayed in at age to age 20.
Sorry, yeah. And the group you compared with, how big was that? The same number? Or?
In terms of dropouts, or in terms, so the numbers were in terms of the egg donation family, one of our control groups, egg donation families, there were 51 at the beginning, and with the control group of families with unassisted conception, there were 80.
Okay. And my third part question is then, you said that the surrogacy mothers, which was these mothers taking care of the children, they were more involved, they were more emotionally involved, they showed greater warmth to that was the result. How did you measure this?
Okay, so we measured this in a number of ways. Firstly, using standardized interviews that were designed specifically. I mean, these are they take about an hour and a half to conduct, but they've been designed specifically to look at quality of parenting and the quality of relationships between parents and the child. And they're very standardized, so the questions are asked in quite a flexible way, but all of these constructs to do with parenting are coded according to very strict criteria for warmth, let's say, on a 6-point scale. And then to look at the reliability of the raters, then another interviewer or researcher recodes the interview independently so that we can be sure that the ratings are reliable. So that's one way, but we also use standardized questionnaires completed by all the family members. We also look at observational assessments between mothers and the child and fathers and the child. Again, these are coded in a very standardized, objective way. So we use a number of different methods.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And next number, yeah, please.
Yes, thank you all, and especially thank you to Susan for an excellent presentation on an important subject. I'm Anna-Karin Lind, I'm a representative for the clinics, and it's interesting to hear about the Nordic perspective. But I was wondering, in England, how many children are born each year by surrogacy? Maybe you said that, and I had no.
I didn't, because I don't think we're absolutely sure, and I don't know exactly, but the figure is somewhere between a few hundred and more than 1,000. It's a few hundred who officially go to court to apply for a parental order, but there have been some reports that there are more than that. I'm not absolutely sure. I'm not really an expert on numbers.
No, but and then how many of those are from the public care, or are most of them from abroad, or are they from?
No, so, I mean, of the few hundred, these are all carried out in the United Kingdom.
Yes.
With UK families, UK surrogates. What's less sure is how many are coming from abroad.
Yes, I understand that.
Yeah.
But still people go abroad, and why is that? Is it because the waiting time, or is it?
Yeah, it's generally because there aren't so many surrogates in the UK. It's still quite difficult to find a surrogate. Also, the process is quite slow because the surrogate and the intended parents are encouraged to get to know each other well and to take a long time to really think about it. And if they want to go ahead and so on. And some people want to do things more quickly and they go abroad.
Okay.
And it's, you know, if you go to America where commercial surrogacy is
Yes.
allowed, there are more surrogates, so that's why.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Who was next? Were you on the list? Yeah.
Yes, I was. So thank you so
Fine,
much.
I trust in you.
So thank you. My questions are also to you, Susan. And I had the similar question as before, so I don't have to ask that. So out of 42 surrogacy families, 21 remained at the end of the survey, if I understood you correctly. And I was wondering about the control group that you looked at. Did they have the similar socio and economic structures as the surrogacy families? And I was also asking the mothers that gave birth in the control group, did you ask them anything about their physical well-being after their child came that might influence how a woman takes on motherhood? And yes, my third question was about the research you said conducted by Vasanti Yadva and Susan Imrie, where they asked surrogacy mothers abroad, if I understood you correctly. How did they find the women that they interviewed? Thank you so much.
Lot of questions.
I'll answer the third one first while it's in my mind. I'm sorry if that was confusing. They were not abroad. The Susan Imrie Vasanti Jadva study was UK surrogates. So I think that answers that question. The first one was about the matching of the socio-demographic characteristics of the unassisted conception control group, which we did as far as possible in terms of ratings such as social class and so on, but it was quite difficult to match for the number of children in the family because people having assisted reproduction or surrogacy generally are older when they have their first child. For unassisted conception families, by the time the mother is older, they've often had more children. So the surrogacy family will be having their first child, could be the second or third. So we matched as far as we could, but there were some issues like that we just had to deal with statistically rather than matching exactly on these variables. So, and the second question, sorry, I can't remember.
Yes, I was wondering about the control group once again, the mothers that had given birth, because you said that the
about
mothers...
physical,
yeah,
yes.
physical, like...
Actually, I suppose partly because we're psychologists and social scientists, I don't think we did ask very much about the physical side. But and with any of these academic papers, you know, I'm happy to send them. Thank you.
Okay,
Okay,
please.
thank you very much for interesting presentation. I'm Ulrik Kihlbom, Medical Ethics, Karolinska Institutet. So I was slightly surprised by the sixth recommendation in the Danish Council, and that was the recommendation that the surrogate should be considered to be the mother.
Yeah.
So so my question is, was there any, or were there any reasons or justifications for that? And to the other panel members, have there been similar discussions in the other countries regarding that point?
Okay, thanks.
Let's start with Denmark.
Yeah.
Then
So I think so there are two ways in which you can look at the kind of, or many ways, of course, but one consideration that played a role was that it can serve as a form of protection for the surrogate in the sense that you can regret, and of course you can find all kinds of empirical that probably doesn't happen that often and so on. But that played a role for some of them. So it's basically just that you have you have more power in some sense, even though you could say some would also see it's a relief not to, because it might also in a sense be a risk that you can get or you have to keep the child in some way. So that's the kind of back and forth. But I think the main reason was that they wanted to kind of give the surrogate more power in a sense juridically. And I think the ones who said it shouldn't be, I think that was mostly when she hadn't contributed genetics herself.
Okay, thank you. What about Finland, have you been discussing this?
Well, I think the discussion is now concentrating on the principal question if surrogacy should be allowed or not, so that going into the details and then the legal options is not on our agenda, but also a different thing compared to the Danish process is that in our medical ethics committee we practically never vote, and we don't count for pros and cons, and because we are also always trying to get a consensus, and then some political members of parliament might leave their name that they disagree, but usually we are trying to get a consensus. But it's most interesting to hear what you are doing in Denmark.
And in Norway. Yeah.
Yeah, we haven't explicitly formulated that question for the board, so I can't tell you what the board thinks about that question, but of course it has been a part of the discussions on surrogacy in general. And yeah, my ballpark guess would be that it would be somewhere similar to the Danish positions. But, yeah.
Thank you. What about the chat? Any? Nothing so far. Then we continue, please.
I could give you a chat.
You are the chat. Yes, please.
So my name is Per Landgren. I belong to the council here in Sweden. I think we could spend a few minutes around concepts, and I really loved Martin's PowerPoints, both on the world picture from Denmark's side and also the bifurcation, where you had the separation, the differentiation of surrogacy into altruistic and commercialized, or what word did you use?
Yeah, commercial.
Yeah,
I think it's the
and commerce, you know, that's the old Latin word for handel, for, you know, exchange and so on. So perhaps you all could say something about the relevance of this difference. Someone said that there is always money involved, and when we go back to your bifurcation, both of them had commerce and altruistic elements in them. So is it a relevant distinction, really?
Okay. Yeah, should I just say something first? Yes. So I didn't mention it, but there's actually a little discussion of it in the report, because personally, at least, I think the most intuitive would be to consider altruistic and egoistic. That's both kind of etymologically and conceptually, and then you would have commercial and non-commercial. And I think it's part of the history of this debate that someone has kind of established this configuration of concepts, so it's become this opposition. Because at least, of course, we often associate commercial activities with egoistical activities, but that's a particular political and philosophical position to think that the commercial, per definition, is egotistical. I think it could just as well kind of be altruistic in depending on how it's set up, I would think, at least. So that, but of course, there are a lot of contexts where we know that commercial motives have a certain effect. So I think, and that's the background, but yeah, I don't know whether that answers a bit of you, or at least it says a bit more about the distinction. Yeah.
Kathy also.
Yeah, I would like to add that that discussion on money and commercial or business is it when we are looking at surrogacy from developing countries and from families with really poor living conditions, and where getting this surrogacy business is kind of only way to buy a car or a house for your family, and then and also we know from some documents, not any research results I haven't seen, but some documents on TV that, for example, in Georgia, that when something goes wrong with the pregnancy and the baby is not healthy or complication in delivery, a CP or something like that, and then the rich family from rich country says that we're not taking that baby, that we have the agreement to get a healthy baby, and there really the issues and the morals come into discussion, and so that are we really taking advantage of women who are poor and in really bad living conditions, and who really don't have other choices, or really maybe also cannot make up the decision for themselves.
Yeah. Howard, please.
Yeah, we chose to use the word non-commercial instead of altruistic. That was an explicit choice in order to kind of to focus on surrogacy rather than having a discussion on what is altruism per se. And also we thought that it kind of reflected better the political debate on whether it should be a compensation or whether it should be a market value price that you pay to the surrogate mother. Also, I think it's important when we're talking about concepts here is to remember that it's not the surrogate mother that we should think about when we're discussing commercial, non-commercial, or altruistic. Also, like the clinic, the third party that is actually organizing it all. When we look at what the cost for surrogacy in the US is, what do you pay the surrogate mother isn't the majority of the expenses. It's the medical, it's the jurist, the lawyers, and stuff like that. So there is, we need to remember that there is, and when we're talking about the money in surrogacy, there is a big portion that goes to other things than just the surrogate mother.
Thank you. One, two. Please.
Hi, thank you. So I'm Stephen Wilkinson from Lancaster University in the UK. So I was about to ask that question, but I'm going to ask a different question to Susan, which is, you said something really interesting at the end of your talk, which I was kind of thinking about on the way through, which is that families who use surrogacy are presumably enthusiastic parents. They wanted to be parents, they wanted to found a family, and they were willing to put a lot of effort into this, whereas natural conception families, some of them may be completely accidental, some of them may drift into parenting or feel that it's a nice idea without having really thought about it. But if you're going to have a surrogacy family or lots of ARTs, you definitely must be on board and enthusiastic with it. So when you're comparing those families to the natural conception families, are the natural conception families in your sample, does that include some people who are sort of lackluster or unenthusiastic parents, or did you select them to be equally enthusiastic, so they had the same level of motivational positivity as the others? Sure. And how powerful do you think this is an explanatory theory? So in terms of ART families doing well, is part of that because they're all enthusiastic from the start?
Can you hear me?
No, okay. They can't on the web. So.
Oh, yes, of course. Okay, thanks, Stephen. No, it's a great question. I mean, we would ideally have had our comparison group of unassisted conception as those who had definitely planned to have a child. And it was just too difficult to do that, so we didn't. So in a way, it's a bit speculative, but certainly, I mean, most of them were very pleased and, wanted to have children. They weren't children by accident or they didn't want, but we didn't specifically assess that or use it as an inclusion criterion. But I do think people who have surrogacy, either they do feel positive about it. A lot of people who have fertility problems and can't have a child any other way would not choose surrogacy, because having this third person involved, and it's much more than having a donor, is somebody who may stay involved with your family as your child grows up. It's only a very small group of intended parents who actually find, that they can accept that as something that would, for them, be a way forward in terms of having children. So they're quite a specialised group in the first place. But yes, I mean, I do think, but again, you know, this isn't so much data-based, it's more impressionistic, that a lot of the reason for the better outcomes for our surrogacy families, because we also see it in other kinds of families where parents have had to jump over a lot of hurdles to have children, that, you know, they have, for example, like gay fathers, you know, they thought they would never be able to be parents when they were younger. And it's, you know, they talk about how amazing, how special, how privileged and lucky they feel that they are able to be parents. It's something that they very much want, or they would have dropped off along the way. But I think, you know, they've had to go through so much. In a way, they're the ones who really want to be parents, but also they really appreciate being parents and value it and feel very lucky, so they're very involved with the child. Thanks.
So perhaps the bottom line is that it's a good thing to be born as a highly wanted and longed for child. Not surprising. So this will be the last question. Please.
Thank you. I'm T.S. Skan. I work for the National Board of Health and Welfare in Sweden. I wanted to mainly raise a comment, because I think there's one ingredient that I'm missing in the discussion, although I get so many different thoughts and ideas about from the presentations. Thank you for those. But I think Kati touched upon this, and it's really the human rights. How do we ensure the human rights for the woman concerned, the surrogate, but also for the child? And Kati touched upon the fact that some children, once they're born, if they're sick, who takes care of them? And we had a very interesting documentary this summer in Sweden where an agency who is operating here in Stockholm apparently was involved in cases where they had not really checked the family or made any conditions for the family who was seeking to use a surrogate mother. And in those cases, you still really start wondering who's going to safeguard the rights of the children being born, that they are coming to families who are healthy and capable of taking care of the child, not too old and sickly, and also that they are not convicted of sexual crimes and things like that, because that's actually happening. So I think that should be at the forefront also of the discussion, not only safeguarding that women are not being exploited, which is very important, both here and abroad, but also the children's rights once they're born, but also how do you select the parents to be. So that's a comment more than a question, but I'm happy to hear your comments on that.
Anyone want to? Yeah, everyone. Yeah. Kati, please start.
I suppose we agree 100%. And that's the discussion we are having in Finland, that it seems that we are going to more liberal direction, and we are going to have legislation on surrogacy in Finland maybe in 5 years or something like that. But also in our committee, we start from the point of view of the child.
Yeah, I don't know whether I should just, so it's, yeah, I should have mentioned it, I think, because I don't disagree, and my council didn't disagree, and it actually especially the child's human rights played a really big role when they discussed it, and especially in relation to commercial surrogacy. And we also briefly touched upon the age question and so on, but even though they went into a lot of details, that's they had to stop at some point. But it's definitely also a consideration, and also the whole kind of background check. But I think for the Danish Council, because their main recommendation was actually that this should be treated as within the altruistic perspective as any other form of assisted reproductive technologies, and already in Denmark there are obligations to check background and so on. So, but it's really important.
But I think that in all our countries we have regulated counseling for adoption and for foreign adoption, and those principles should be followed also in surrogacy.
Yeah, I was thinking about like the if you're getting a child through surrogacy abroad and you're a Norwegian, you have to go through this stepchild adoption process, right? And as a part of that adoption process, there are some safeguards there in order to make sure that the parents are capable. However, the problem is that this is a process that starts after the child is born. So how can we do anything before the child is born or before it? And the thing is that our countries, we can only regulate what is happening inside our own borders, right? And we are totally dependent on the countries where our citizens visit to actually safeguard the children. And the only option to that is international regulations, something through the UN or I don't know. Yeah.
Okay. Have you some closing words, Susan? Or?
Yeah, I'll just say something about the UK. I mean, a bit like you've just said, there is, when the courts appoint somebody called the Guardian in the UK, and whose sole role is to be concerned with the well-being and the rights of the child. But again, this doesn't happen till the parents apply to become legal parents. But there is a move by the Law Commission in the UK to give more power to surrogacy organisations, but to make them more regulated. And a report has gone to government from the Law Commission that will move things more in that direction. But we've just had several changes in government, so things have got a bit stuck. But that is the direction of travel as well. Thank you.
Thank you. And now the discussion must and can continue during coffee break, and we reassemble at 11:45, 11:45. Coffee outside on the right. Thank you.